Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hello, bestie. Hope you're having a wonderful, amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So absolute no-brainer to subscribe to this community and be part of the people that are changing the world. I'm here with Deborah Penza. Deborah, how's it going?
It's great. It's Friday.
Good. Yeah, that's good enough. So you're a ethics and compliance thought leader. You have a really cool, interesting story that I am excited to kind of dive into and hear some of your perspective on what's top of mind, how you got where you're at, and the lessons that we can share with our listeners, so we can help make the world a better workplace and really elevate ethics and compliance to this strategic lever that I think it should be.
Fantastic.
So how did you? Why don't we start at the beginning with you? How did you, when you were 7 and you were looking forward to becoming a compliance officer? What was it that drove you there?
Yeah. So strangely enough, I thought my background. I have my undergraduate degree is in political science. And I really thought, as I was heading to DC for grad school, that I would be a policy wonk on Capitol Hill. And that was my direction. Thought that was where I was going. Moved to DC, started grad school, had an internship on Capitol Hill with a first term congressman. And he was fantastic. But quickly after arriving on Capitol Hill and witnessing that lifestyle, if you will, I realized that was not what I wanted for my career. And I actually, as I was in grad school, thought that I would, when I graduated, eventually move to apply to the CIA or the FBI. And this was my focus. Mm-hmm. And while I was in grad school, I had been waiting tables and was eventually landed as a temporary working as an admin receptionist for 3 lobbying firms that shared office space in DC. And I had only been there, I think, less than 2 months when one of the principals for one of the lobbying firms lost his 2 part-time employees at the same time. One was a legislative analyst and one was his admin. And he asked if I would be willing to take on both roles in a full-time position. I thought, wow, this is great because I have really no job experience.
Yeah,
and that
perfect.
He's willing to hire me was fantastic. I could barely type and was pretty excited. And so about 6 weeks after I joined him in a full-time role, he told me that Richard Cousireau, who had been Inspector General of Health and Human Services, had announced his retirement and was going to join him in a new company, a consulting company that they were creating a sister company. And Dick would consult on the fraud and abuse law that he had promulgated as Inspector General. And I said, this is really exciting, sure. And so Dick joined us, he moves in, and I think maybe a month after he started the company, National Medical Enterprises, which is now known as Tenet Healthcare Corporation, came to him to serve as an expert witness. They had been under investigation for violations of healthcare fraud. And when they were speaking to him about serving as an expert witness and he was looking at the complaint against them, he said, well, you really ought to think about implementing a compliance program. Now, this was 1992. The sentencing guidelines had only been out for about a year. This is when sentencing guidelines, compliance programs were a footnote in the sentencing guidelines, and nobody knew what a compliance program was. And so the standard response was, what's that? And he explained the sentencing guidelines and what might happen, and that this would be a way to perhaps mitigate the damages that they potentially faced. And they said, okay, that sounds good, but who can do this for us? And Dick, being Dick, if you ever have the chance to interview him, he's fantastic. He said, oh, I can do that. So he comes back to the office and says to me, I said, how'd the meeting go? He said, great, we're going to implement a compliance program for them. And I said, what's that? that's how I got into compliance. And so, it was just the two of us initially. Dick was out there, and one client led to another. And I would joke that we had the government's top 10 most wanted as clients. Everybody that was under a major investigation at that point was likely a client of ours, and we were building their compliance program. And so the company grew over time. And I still had in the back of my mind that I was leaving to go to the FBI, and I had scheduled to sit for the FBI exam. And I think one of my coworkers ratted me out to Dick, and he called me into his office the day before I was supposed to sit for the exam. And he handed me a folded up piece of paper, and I opened it, and there was this number on it. I said, "What's this?" He said, "It's your new salary if you don't go sit for that exam." And it was more than I would ever make in the federal government.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And
Did you rethink that goal a little, huh?
Yeah, I did. I said, okay, well, I guess I'm not sitting for the exam. And so that really solidified my career in compliance. By then I was, running my own clients. We kept a small base because we were still a small firm. We kept ourselves to about, no more than 16 clients in the firm at that time, because there were just a few of us as consultants and some staff in the home office. And, and this was before hotline companies even existed.
Right.
And so, when we had clients say to us, well, who can run our hotline? Dick, being Dick, said, oh, we can. And I can remember that when we were in the office, if we weren't traveling, we all had hotlines ringing at our desk for customers.
Oh my gosh.
And we would pick up and we would take their hotline calls. And we eventually spun that off as its own sister company. But yeah, so I spent about 9 years with Dick. I was the only employee that did not have a non-compete agreement, because I was the first. And Dick always told me, if something comes along that interests you, go for it.
Yeah.
And I had discussions over the years, but there was nothing really that exciting. But in 2001, Hikma Pharmaceuticals came along, and I thought this was interesting. They were multinational, looking to implement a compliance program for the first time in relation to having received a consent decree from the FDA for a plant in the US. And so this was just a really great opportunity for me. I could stay in DC. And so I joined Hikma and helped build out their compliance program. Actually worked for a really fantastic mentor, Dr. Arthur Falk, who had come from Warner Lambert and Pfizer. And so we built the compliance program there together. And he encouraged me. He was one of those fantastic mentors that sat me down and said, hey, is there anything that you wanted to do for your career but never had a chance to? And I said, back when we started doing this a decade or so ago, and clients would ask us who should be the compliance officer, we would say, you don't need a particular background. You really want somebody who knows your business, knows your people, somebody that people trust because they're willing to come to that person with issues and concerns, and somebody that is going to use good judgment in dealing with the issues that arise. And so we, at the time, in the beginning, we compliance officers come from all types of backgrounds. It might be financial, it might be a nurse, it could, it was all kinds of backgrounds. But by the time I had gone into Hikma, compliance officer roles were going to attorneys. And I said to him, I think if I ever want to move into the chief compliance officer role, that I really need to get my law degree. So he supported that. So I went back to law school while working at Hikma, part-time at night. I had finished my first year of law school when Art announced he was retiring. And I became the chief compliance officer and was traveling over 100,000 miles a year while finishing up my last 2 years of law school.
What was that like?
It was crazy. And I
so when is this? This is 2003 area?
This is 2002 to 3. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was really,
I mean, my gosh, just having your regular job and then getting your law degree would have been a lot. And then you get, kind of thrown into the pool again.
Yeah. And I
you just
really
keep kind of getting pushed into this compliance pool, don't you?
Yeah, I do, right? But it was great for me. And I had so many supportive people around me. And that's the key, right? You have relationships that you've built, people that support you. I had a fantastic team at Elan of compliance professionals that
Yeah.
were getting it done, and we all worked collaboratively together to make it happen. And yeah, I remember my schedule was to the point that I would come home uh, from class Wednesday night. I would get up early Thursday morning. I would fly out to San Diego early in the morning, and I would spend Thursday and Friday in San Diego, and I would jump on the red eye home Friday night so
Oh
I
my
could be
gosh.
home to
And where were
study
you
all.
at? Where was home? Where was Alon at that time?
Well, initially when I started, so my first 2 years, I was still in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
Virginia area. And
Wow.
then my last year of grad school, the last semester, I had moved to New Jersey because we closed our DC offices
Mm.
and I was working from home. And the way we were changing things, I actually moved to New Jersey to be closer to the offices there. So I was actually commuting from New Jersey down to DC
My gosh.
to go to school, and then coming home Wednesday night and then flying from Philly. So it was a really crazy time. I don't remember how I managed to
I mean,
get
could you
through
imagine
those.
doing that again?
No, I'm too old for that now.
But it is funny when you
I don't
start.
think my body could take it
Yeah,
now.
yeah, you just fall apart in the airport. It is funny though when you start traveling like that, and they really do make you feel good when you get that gold card or that platinum card, and you get status, and then like literally that like wears off in like a month or something. You're like, I am traveling like a lunatic.
It's depressing, right? I
Yeah.
remember walking in one time to the La Jolla Marriott, and I was only there for one night, and they upgraded me to this really nice room. And I walked in, and there was an envelope that had my name on it, and I opened it, and it says, "Welcome home."
Yeah, and you're
It's
like,
like,
ah, this
it's
is
not
actually
good.
true. Your mail is
I like
actually
you
on the
guys.
desk. Yeah, yeah.
I like all of you. You're lovely, but I don't want this to be my
I don't
home.
want this to be my home. So when did so you kind of got kind of pushed into the chief compliance officer pool. You
Yeah.
graduated from grad school.
Yeah.
What was the state of things in your career, your company at that time, and how did that, and also what was going on in like the broader world? Because there was so much change happening around that time.
Right. Remember, we're talking now the early 2000s. So we had, the war in Afghanistan. We had just come out of Tyco, those Enron Tyco scandals,
Mm-hmm.
and what that meant for compliance. And, in our own organization, Elan, if you read the history, Elan had gone through a lot,
Right.
and what was interesting about Elan is that Elan was a company that grew through acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem, though, is that when you looked at the company, when you looked at the acquisitions, I used to liken it to driving down the road and then coming across this house that has all different design. It's a colonial, but it's got a
Mm-hmm.
modern wing. It's
The Art
got
Deco
the
windows.
Art
Yeah.
Deco wing, right? Tudor wing. It's got all these things that don't really come together. And,
Right.
and it was one of the things I learned about acquiring companies, but not completing the integration.
Mm-hmm.
And what does good look like? What does bad look like? How could it be improved? Because it was something I think we could have done better. And what happened is I was coming into Elan in 2001. We had built all that up. And what happened in shortly after I got there, within the first year, is that we had an Alzheimer's candidate that failed in phase 3 trial.
Mm.
And it was pretty devastating to the company. And because of the Enron situation, Elan's financial reporting also came under scrutiny.
Right.
And I remember walking into the office one
Just in
day,
general.
just in general, right?
Right.
There were some, because of all of the M&A activity that was going
Totally.
on, there were questions and we were listed on the UK exchange and the US stock exchange. And so there were questions about how we were reporting, what we were
Mm.
reporting, and what was going on with these acquisitions. And we had a lot of joint ventures. So the business model, the thinking, everything was this drive towards curing Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
And so we had a lot of these joint ventures that the idea was we would invest in the company. And if the product or products developed, when it looked like they would be approved, the thought was you acquire that company or you're getting revenue from that company that's helping to drive the R&D to support the Alzheimer's work.
Mm-hmm.
And but because of the scrutiny on the reporting, and this is pre-SOX, the scrutiny, everything sort of started falling apart. And with the Alzheimer's candidate failing, it was bad. And I remember coming into the office one day and picking up the Wall Street Journal, and the headline said, Alon in death spiral.
You're like, it sure feels like a death spiral. It sounds like everybody knows about it now.
It did,
Yeah.
right? And we went through this period of time where, so we, our CEO of many years ends up leaving.
Right.
The CFO ends up leaving. We get a new CEO, there's turnover in the management team. And, and we were things that all these companies we had acquired were now divesting, selling off. And so we had gone through this big growth phase, and now we're shrinking down. And,
right.
I stayed there for 9 years, and, it was really hard to see, some of those changes. It was the first company I had been in,
right.
Publicly held company, and witnessing what so many of us do, where you have to make tough decisions
Totally.
about reducing headcount and the stress that puts on compliance, right? When you see product lines being sold off, people being laid off, people being moved around,
mm-hmm.
Making sure that if there are issues that you're aware of them, those exit interviews become so important, and the relationships that you have with employees become so important, so that you're aware of if there are things happening as we're shutting down businesses or selling them off, what's going on.
So talk to me a little bit about the stress on compliance during that, because there's a similar, everything comes in these waves, right? And it's kind of interesting. We have there's a conference coming up with ECI, and we're doing a whole presentation on exit interviews, because this seems to be kind of coming back into the conversation for folks. And it's almost like this new thing that's been around forever. Interesting you're bringing it up now. So I'd love to kind of dive a little bit into the importance of those exit interviews, kind of in general, and then specifically in the context of the pain that compliance is feeling, because as you know, like this great resignation, or the great recalibration, as I call it, it's real, and it's happening at good companies, and it's happening at bad companies, and there's just a new labor mobility. There's a new work from home preference that some folks have. Like, I can work for a company in Colorado and never leave the state that I'm in, right? So that just breaks down a bunch of walls. Everyone's kind of used to doing business over Zoom and stuff like that. So that has just changed the whole game very quickly. And so it's not the exact same thing, but it's very, like, the implications of it, the symptoms in terms of like stress on a compliance program or stress on an organization at large is kind of similar probably to a lot of what you went through. What are some of those lessons you learned, and talk about like how that felt, during that stressful time of the death spiral or whatever you went through?
Yeah. Well, it's hard one, because you're losing good colleagues from the organization, people that and trust and have those relationships with, the people that are willing to come to your office and close the door and say, hey, I just need to talk to you about this, or pick up the phone and say, hi, are you aware? Or did you know, right? And when you lose those relationships, it hurts compliance, because the people you were relying on to keep you informed and keep you in the loop, if you will, are now gone, right? And then sometimes you have people taking on responsibilities that they're either not qualified for, or they've never had before. Are new to them, and they're feeling pressured too. And especially when a company is under financial pressure, there's great pressure on everyone to perform. And of course, those are the things that keep compliance officers up at night, right? Because then, are people cutting corners on quality? Are they starting to promote off-label? Are they doing all of these things we worry about because they're being pressured to perform? And so that requires the compliance team to step it up even more, to be reaching out to people, to communicate with people, to ensure the training is meaningful, that people know they can come and raise questions and concerns if they have them, that, they're not, and I think, when organizations go through that, the fear always is, if I'm the person that comes forward, am I going to end up on that next list for RIF, for reduction in force?
Yeah, right.
Right? Is that the unknown or unspoken retaliation that occurs, that I'm going to be next in that group if I speak up?
That's a great
And
point.
so,
Wow, there's so much in what you just said. So I guess some of those things I hadn't really thought of. In these times of like stress on a company, to your point, it's like, hey, fog a mirror. Oh, cool, you're breathing, you have a pulse. Great. Can you do this job that you have no idea about? And it's not like, and like the stakes are higher because there's a panic, there's an undercurrent of actual, more stress. Is this company going to be around, or what are the, like, how many blows can this, can this thing take? And so there's, when people fall into their backup styles, like, I don't know, I'm a certain way, and then when I feel attacked, I fall into the caged animal or something, right? Like we all do that, right? When a company falls into its backup style, that's kind of a function of the culture, essentially, I think, that it's living through, and which is just the amalgamation of the people in all their own individual high-stress backup styles. I mean, it can lead to some brutal outcomes, but I just hadn't really put together that not only is it like, hey, do this job you don't know how to do, which, again, all the tacit knowledge or all the tribal knowledge or all the, implicit compliance in this sort of specific case, all that specific, where those lines are to make sure I don't color outside of those. If those aren't documented or downloaded to the new person, which is rarely going to happen when someone's like, when the person who's being replaced is like a RIF sort of victim, it just exponentially explodes. The risk potential of the company, explodes. And also, I also didn't think about the opportunity for sort of like covert retaliation in that whole like mess of like, well, we got a bunch of layoffs. Like you can squeeze people into that pretty easily, which again is another headwind for compliance, because how do you crowdsource risk management if people aren't willing to speak up? And they're either going to speak up or not speak up because of actual retaliation or perceived retaliation. So it's like, nothing, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but like nothing grows on a straight line, like it's like little by little and then all at once. It's like everything's fine. And then you hit a tipping point and it's like, well, now we're in a massive risk area, or a massive risk environment or like climate or something.
Yeah. Right. And you have to manage that. And eventually, right, it settles out. We had another drug candidate come along. Things were better. We stabilized, and it gets better. But riding that wave, making sure you know what's going on. It's one of the reasons why whenever there's a reduction in force in any firm I work at, I always ask to see the list. Because I want to know who's on there, and if I've had any dealings with that person, through the speak up line or through an investigation, and how did this person end up on the list and why, right? And usually there's a legitimate reason why, but you want to be sure that there is not some covert retaliation going on against somebody.
Yeah, that's a great point. From a reduction in force in workforce standpoint, like against or compared to just like a high churn standpoint, which is really, I guess businesses that are failing notwithstanding, like what similarities and what differences do you think there are from somebody who's in an ethics and compliance seat to navigate through it in like the most sort of graceful way?
Yeah. So usually your senior compliance folks hopefully have a seat at the table and are aware that a RIF is coming and are part of that discussion. And just like we, your employment counsel, your HR team are looking through that to make sure, it doesn't appear that you are adversely impacting certain minorities or other groups in the organization. We take the same look-see at it to make sure it doesn't, that there doesn't appear that we're retaliating against individuals that have, been part of an investigation. So if your compliance program is mature, you are having these conversations routinely, hopefully anyway, with employment counsel, with HR, and they recognize that you're part of that process. to ensure those discussions happen.
And let's talk about kind of exit interviews in the mix of that.
Yeah.
Is that because historically a lot of from my understanding, or most of the people that I talk to today, when I talk about exit interviews, they're like, oh, HR handles that, which I have a whole sort of like philosophy on that. But I find it interesting that you brought it up. Was that something that you would say is a best practice for compliance to do, at least have a hand in? Did you guys handle them? What kind of stuff did you learn from those to identify some of these potential like retaliation issues or whatever?
It's funny because we've been harping on exit interviews since Dick and I first started. And Dick was a big fan of exit interviews. And I would say we had some best practices that I think have fallen by the wayside, even for me. So yeah, HR is typically handling that. I think it's important to ensure there are some compliance questions that are in there. I think it's best practice to actually go out and look at those exit interviews for compliance, to periodically do a look-see at the exit interview. Hopefully HR is alerting you if something pops up in an exit interview, but that they're asking compliance related questions as that interview goes on. One of the things that you just reminded me, it's one of the things we used to recommend to our clients, and we actually used to handle for them at the firm. And I will confess, we're not doing this, but I do think, maybe to your point, in this period that we're going through, one of the things that, and I think Dick was right, one of the things that happens is when employees are leaving, they may not be comfortable telling you what their concerns are, right? They might be worried about getting a good referral, a good reference. They might be worried about maybe the severance package, whatever it is that they're worried about. So they may not be comfortable, and maybe they're not comfortable telling the HR person about their concern, right? And so one of the things we used to recommend is sending, and you could do it via email. I'm dating myself. We used to say mail, but now you could email that same questionnaire to that employee 2 weeks, 3 weeks after they've left the firm, when everything is sort of settled down, and see if you get any different information.
We find that over 60% of the answers, reasons are different after the fact, after the dust has settled, because there's that, like, it's such
Whatever
a thing.
it is.
We're all in like self-preservation mode to some degree. You know what I'm saying? And even
especially if you're being ripped out of the company.
Totally.
I think if there's something personal at stake, whether it's financially or professionally, because you are relying on that next reference, whatever it is, people don't want to rock the boat. Yeah, so that's consistent, right?
Yeah, and there's just a gold mine of information in those exit interviews where, in theory, whether it's the first one while they're still employed on their way out or the one following up after the fact, where the main thing in theory is removed, the main thing preventing them from speaking up, right, which is the fear of retaliation. There was this ECI report that I always talk about. 70-something percent, 78% of people who actually spoke up last year experienced retaliation of some kind, covert, direct, indirect, whatever. This is from people who actually spoke up. So even if it's half of that number, that's 2 in 5. That's a massive amount of people. You know what I'm saying? So that's a very, very real thing, as you know, and you've been in this game since literally the start of it, and you've been on the hotline side, and you've been on the in the saddles side, so to speak. It's such a plethora of great information if it's done in like a credible way, because at the end of the day, we want programs to actually work, and we want them to, I think, be perceived to be working, right, by the people that are in power and so forth. Yeah. But for them to actually work, we need data points to make sure that we're on the road, right? And like what a great rumble strip those exit interviews can be to make sure that the program's functioning right, or if it's not, you can get kind of an earlier read than you otherwise would get, just from an odds perspective,
Absolutely. And you may learn about something going on that you had no idea.
Totally.
Right. What's happening.
Okay, so you made it through
Made it
Thanks for that
through
aside.
Elan.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, graduated grad school, was at Elan for another 4 years. And we were moving things down, shutting more things down. And I saw that, Elan was eventually sold, not maybe 1 or 2 years after I left the organization. So I decided I was ready for a change. I had been there a long time. And so I left the company in 2010, and I took a few months to myself. And in 2000 and the end of 2010, I interviewed with Watson Pharmaceuticals
Oh, cool.
and joined Watson the beginning of 2011. And wow, with this, working at Watson, working with Paul Bizzarro, who was the CEO, and the other members of that executive management team, to me, it was magical.
What's his name? Paul Bufano?
Paul Bizzarro.
Bizzarro. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. If you talk to people in the generics industry, they refer to him as the generics Jesus. His nickname. But what was brilliant about Watson, so I was brought on, I was their first full-time compliance officer. Watson had gone truly global in 2010 through an acquisition, and they wanted a global compliance program. So I joined. And what was amazing about this is that it was one of those unique lifetime career experiences where you have a group of people that just really get along, really like each other, and are driven.
Wow.
And if you know the Watson history, between 2010 and 2015, when Paul stepped down as the CEO into the exec chair role, we just were on an acquisition trail. And I tell people all the time, you only know about the deals that we closed. You don't know about the deals that we lost, walked away from.
Right.
And it was just
dozens and dozens of deals, I'd imagine.
Oh, we lived and breathed it. And I can remember we were acquiring one company, and somebody said to me, well, when do you do your big picture thinking? And I said, well, let's see. I said, I spend most of my day in data rooms looking at the next deal. And I said, oh, by the way, the team that we use to perform due diligence, that's the same team that integrates the companies that we acquire. And so we do our day jobs that we were hired for sometime in between those two activities. And big picture thinking usually happens at 2:47 a.m. when I'm awake in bed trying to think about everything I need to do. But it was just fantastic, right? And so many great experiences to have that M&A experience, integration, seeing this machine that we built. And eventually we acquired Activist. We took the Activist name globally. We couldn't use Watson globally. And we eventually acquired, a number of other companies, Warner Chilcott, Forest Labs. As I was
massive
leaving,
acquisitions,
Yeah, as I was leaving, we were finishing the Allergan acquisition.
Wow.
And so, when Paul moved into the executive chairman role, myself, like some others, decided that we were ready to move on.
Interesting. And, what was going on there in your mind, in your heart?
Things were changing, right? In the firm, a number of people as we were acquiring Forest. So when we were acquiring Forest, Paul had decided that he was going to step into the executive chairman role. And that was consistent with what he was thinking about, moving out of the CEO role. And so Brent Saunders, who had been the CEO of Forest, was now going to become the CEO of Activist. And then as he was CEO as we were acquiring Allergan. And I think a number of us just decided that, when it's time. Mm-hmm. And so a number of the other executive team were leaving and going to different places. And I was just kind of trying to decide what I wanted to do. And sure enough, the head of our global brands business had become CEO at Impax Laboratories. And he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm looking for a new compliance officer." And I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Because I might be interested in doing something different." And so fast track, I left I agreed to stay on at Allergan through March of 2015. Was actually, I think, on the books until May. But strangely enough, myself and our employment counsel at activist, she also came over with me to Impact. So we had this great working relationship. Cool. I treated her like my compliance counsel for most investigations. So she's now the head of HR. So we're partnered together again, and with Fred Wilkinson, who was the CEO of Impact. So we just had, a great reunion of folks.
So what was it? So that's, I mean, it's so much easier when you come in, when you kind of know your team, and you see that happen a lot in sports, and you see it happen in companies, obviously, all the time. It helps you get your feet on the ground faster, I think, and it helps you really kind of ramp and make an impact quicker. I guess no pun intended, but how was that change from like a laboratories business from a straight pharmaceuticals business? What was that adjustment like?
Yeah, so Impact Labs was pharmaceuticals. It was more heavily generics. We didn't have as big a brand business, much smaller.
Got it. Okay.
We did not have the global footprint that Watson had, Activist had. So we, much smaller company, much smaller group, building a specialty brand business, and they had just completed an acquisition right before we started.
Okay.
And so we were integrating that, deciding what to do with it, and of course not in the midst of that Impact. So the Impact doesn't come off often, thank goodness. But if you remember Martin Shkreli, Daraprim, his company,
the world's first supervillain. Yeah.
Yes, he purchased that product from Impact.
Really?
It was one of the products that we acquired in the acquisition, and it was not key to our portfolio. And so as they were reviewing the portfolio and what does it make sense to keep, what does it make sense to divest, it was one of those, well, it's there, we're manufacturing it, but it's not key to our strategy. And it was actually, I understand it, Shkreli's company that approached Impacts about purchasing that. And they said, yeah, okay, it's not strategic for us. Sure. And of course, little did we know that.
How crazy was that?
What plans he had for it. Yeah.
That's nuts. That's nuts.
It was really crazy and to see what happened.
So I'd love to circle back, your your second kind of pharma role at Watson. It seemed like that was just a wild time, right? You're doing a ton of acquisitions. You're going international. I mean, that was very different from the sound of it from that first role. As you move to this more like heavily international kind of game, what were some of like the big lessons you learned? How was that game so much different than kind of some of the pools you had swam in before that?
Yeah. So really, the importance of compliance due diligence, right? You're acquiring these companies. When we acquired Activist, they had a significant presence in Eastern Europe and Russia, places we had never been. And, fortunately, Activist also had a strong compliance team, and they were all willing to stay post the acquisition, which was fantastic. So we were able to bring the groups together. And even their chief compliance officer stayed as the head of the international compliance team. So I was very fortunate to have him there and continue the work that they were doing. But, it's a different way of doing business in a lot of these countries. And the risk profile is so much different.
Yeah.
And, I always talk about, the idea of bringing Western style compliance into some of these parts of the world is not easy.
Why?
And the best way I can explain it is I had a colleague who was Bulgarian, and when I first met, he was part of the Activist team when we came together, and we just sat down and had an honest conversation one day. And I think he was in IT. And he said to me, you have to understand that, he goes, you call it bribery. He said, but this is a way of life for us.
Right.
He said,
it's like holding the door for somebody or something.
Yeah. He said, I'll give you the perfect example that I'm going through right now. He said, my girlfriend is about to give birth to our child. if I want to ensure that she delivers a healthy baby girl and that she survives the birth, I will go to the hospital. I will hand an envelope of cash to ensure that she gets a private room.
Mm-hmm.
I will hand an envelope of cash to the doctor to ensure that she gets the best care possible, to ensure the best outcome possible. He said, if I don't, she will get nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And that really struck me because
Totally.
it's things we take for granted living
Totally.
and growing up in the US. I would never, you and I would never think of having to walk into a hospital in the US and pay cash out of our
Totally.
pocket to ensure that we get a high standard of care. We just expect that.
Right.
And, you know, and it's everyday things that they're paying extra money for. The services that you and I take for granted from our government, that's how they operate. And so when you walk in as an American and say, hey, FCPA, UK bribery act.
Right. I mean, they must think that we're so naive or something.
They do, right? Or that we're crazy, or that we are trying to impose our values upon them, our way of living upon them. And it's not to say that, you know,
Yeah,
that,
right.
And look, I get what bribery and corruption does to societies and how we can help to fix that. But, and I, you know, this idea that Western companies can come in and change cultures that have existed for thousands of years is somewhat difficult for me to accept.
So,
And
I mean, like, was that,
I'm going to accept bribery in my firm and we're going to allow it.
well, it's just a lot. It's just, to your point, it's just like a lot more complex of an issue than just say,
It
like,
is
well, you
so
can't do it.
complex.
Like, was that wrong? Was he wrong to do that? Was that unethical for him to go and pay that doctor and pay that hospital so that she could get the room? Honestly.
And even if he thought it was wrong and unfair, he's still going to do it because he loves his girlfriend and their child. And so you're right. It's a different conversation, and that really changed my way of thinking about it, because from there I was out traveling all over Eastern Europe and talking to people,
Passing out money to everybody. Yeah.
talking about how we do this in a way that makes sense and is not offensive to people, but in a way that they understand that, at least as regards our business and the conduct of our business, we must take this approach.
So how do you do that? So that I love that. I mean, I think I get that at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
Where would you draw those lines? I mean, because those are, I mean, because it's such a gray thing.
Yeah, it's through relationships. It's through having constant communications with the senior leaders of those businesses to talk about it, to say, hey, you know, we face significant risk as a company. You face personal risk and liability as an individual. And look, you can do business without doing these things. Let's talk about how we can do business without having to do that.
Yeah.
And if it comes to that, what does it mean if we have to walk away from that business? I mean, my own firm today, you know, we talk about it. My firm, Hikma, was founded in Jordan over 40 years ago. And, you know, if you talk to the compliance team members that were there in early days building compliance, you know, they heard the same thing we all hear, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to sell our products if I'm not allowed to give gifts to doctors, right? Right. And we still have competitors that are local in the region that don't adhere to the same standards and policies that we adhere to. But we're still competitive. Why are we competitive? Because we offer a high quality product.
That's right.
Right. We
I
offer
think that
all the
might
right
be it.
things, right? And I think that's where the discussion starts to happen, is you say to that customer, I can't do this because we believe in conducting our business in an ethical manner. We have these policies to ensure that we don't have conflicts of interest, and I tell them, we're protecting you just as much as we're protecting ourselves. I tell that to my US doctors.
Totally,
I don't
yeah.
ever want you to be in a position where you receive a subpoena from the government telling you that you have to appear with your records related to our company at their office on this date.
Right.
I don't ever want you to get that letter. That's why we go through all the things that we go through.
Yeah, and perhaps it's just that you have to kind of persuade and reframe like what's most important. It's not sales at any cost or by any means. It's sales within the bounds of this program or without sort of stepping over this line, irrespective of what those norms are. And if that's prioritized above, in their actual heart and mind, if that's prioritized above getting that sale, then they're going to be probably more likely to adhere to that and not fall back to those cultural norms or whatever you want to call it.
And knowing that we have their backs, right?
Yeah, totally.
To me, this is the most important part of my job. And I tell my business partners this all of the time. Compliance is not generating revenue. Your success is our success. And
Right.
I want you to be successful. And it's my job to support you. And so if you are running into challenges because of our policies, our approach, come talk to me. Let's have a discussion about it and see how I might be able to help you or what we can do.
Right.
And sometimes I've gotten on the phone with physicians and talked to them about why we can do things and why we can't. I've traveled, to meet with customers to talk about why we're doing one thing and why we're not doing it like our competitors. Or I've given them talking points. I've put brochures together. I remember when the pharma code came out and we weren't giving, when the change to the pharma code came out around giving of tchotchkes. And, suddenly all the offices were up in arms that we weren't giving tchotchkes.
They're like, where are we going to get our tchotchkes? Yeah.
Right. And you can't bring spouses to dinner and all these other things. And, so I put a little pamphlet together for our sales reps to hand out to the physicians explaining, what the government's laws were related to healthcare fraud and the pharma code and why we could no longer do these things. And why it was a risk, not only to them, but to us, and that
Right.
we were doing this for both our protection of both of us. And so I think there are ways to do that. And when the business realizes that you're there to make them successful, it makes all the difference in the
Right.
world.
Well, this is a great convo. I feel like we could probably keep talking for another 30 or 40 minutes. There's so much more I
You
want
and I are like-minded, right?
Totally.
We could talk about compliance for hours
all day, yeah.
and all day, every day, live and breathe it.
So let's wrap up with this. This is a question I always ask. Like, if you could go back to a young Deborah and give her some advice or about a lesson that you would have wished that you learned sooner, what would that be?
For me, it was the importance of being engaged with executive team. So as I was coming up, and I think because I had been a consultant, so my career was flip-flopped. I started as a consultant in my career. I was always engaged with the board of clients, senior executives. And when I came in-house, I was heavily engaged with them.
Mm-hmm.
But then there came a time where through management changes, did not necessarily have a seat at the table.
Interesting.
And I realized that my personality is such that if you don't include me, I don't feel the need to be included and I won't push it.
Got it.
But I realized through a leadership program I had gone through that this was a personality trait. And I realized how it was impacting my relationships, that I needed to proactively go out and meet with people.
Got it.
To have those conversations, because if I didn't, it wouldn't happen.
And how did it change once that light bulb turned on for you? When that switch was
I have
flipped?
to force myself, right? So I force myself now to schedule regular meetings with everybody, to be talking to them, to travel out to them. So even if they're not reaching out to me, I'm reaching out to them.
Amazing.
And yeah,
it's such a little thing, you know. It's like
is.
a little thing can make such a big difference, you know.
it's these personality traits that sometimes we don't even realize we have because they're not obvious to anyone but ourselves.
Right. Well, I think so many of I think all of our personality traits, probably for the most part, are both a positive and a negative, right? And you have to make them you have to augment the things that are going to be detrimental to you, and shave off the things. I'm an extrovert, so I need to learn to shut up sometimes. So that's a skill. But also, if you're more quiet, or to your point, if you're not going to, if you're waiting to get invited to the party, sometimes you have to step into the party. You know what I'm saying?
You have to invite yourself.
You got to invite yourself. You got to just show up to the party, okay?
Show up with that bottle of champagne.
That's right. That's right. Always bring a gift. Well, I really had a great time. This was awesome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
If people want to learn more about you, where can they find you and get in touch?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Deborah Penza. You can find me there.
Very good. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us on the Ethics Experts. Until next time.